Remember lesson 1? Do not hide. That was good stuff. Good stuff, Brian. I like that song. So I want to lead you in a brief meditation, and then I'm going to make you use your voice a little bit in a meditative song. It's an old hymn. Not really that old. It's maybe only 40 years old, 50 years old, I think, at most. But it's kind of a good meditative classic. Some of you know it, and I think you'll like it. So, and if you don't, I don't really care. So you're going to do it anyway. So anyway, first to get there, we do this meditation thing of deep breathing and just kind of take you through an exercise. And you know, when I first started doing it, I wasn't sure how you'd all dig it, but then the overwhelming feedback I get is that it's really helpful, that it's one of the few times in your week, some of you the only time in your week where you are quiet and you actually take time to reflect and breathe deeply. And it's so important. So this thing that we do, it's so good for you physically. It's so good for you for your bloodstream. It's so good for your spirit. There's not a bad thing about it, except for we're not used to it because we're used to noise constantly, and this causes us to be quiet. So please close your eyes and sit up in a way you can breathe deeply. And just start doing that nice and slow. Just take 2 or 3 big, deep breaths in nice and slow and let them go nice and slow. As you start to get into a rhythm, just be aware of what your body is telling you about what kind of stress you've carried in here. It's going to show up on the muscles in your face. And if your shoulders are bunched up, that's going to tell you you're carrying a little something. May show up in back pain, may show up in acid stomach. I don't know. Just check in with your body. It's telling you about yourself. And if you can, relax. It's a safe place. Things in our mind, so just want you to acknowledge what those things are. Treat it like you're sitting on the side of a river and allow each one of these things on your mind to float down in front of your face. Acknowledge it, recognize that it's there, and then let it keep floating. It'll be there later. Sometimes just acknowledging it and letting it go helps you let it go so that you can be fully present here. So one at a time, as you continue to breathe deeply, do that. Continue to breathe deep. I just want you to know this. You are welcome here. That the Spirit of God is present here. The Spirit of God is present to strengthen you where you're weak, to give you hope where you are in mourning, to give you confidence where you feel fearful. God is for you and with you. not endorsing all your biases or all the ways that you see reality in a skewed way, but with you in the sense that the you were created to be in the image of God, God is all about bringing that out, putting flesh on it, helping you become who you are in all of your spectacularness. That's the God who welcomes you here. And so, as we know that the word for breath and spirit are the same in the ancient languages, so I invite you to breathe. But as you inhale, I invite you to welcome the very Spirit of God more deeply into your life and into this space. You might be more open and aware and present to the God who has formed you and loves you. God, calm our fears, fill our hearts, open our minds, strengthen our bones, that we might live. In Jesus' name, amen. So Chris, take us to this song coming up. It's called Spirit of the Living God. This is a classic hymn in the Christian tradition. I love it. I've sung this many, many times, and I'm making you sing it again. And we're going to build this thing. We're going to sing it a total of 3 times. And build it along with me. If you're a terrible singer, that's okay. We'll laugh at you, and then you'll get over that, and we'll go on. But I hope that you will truly get into it. And I hope that you will allow this song to build as we sing it. So let's just sing it together. Spirit of the living God, fall fresh on me. Spirit of the living God, fall fresh on me. Melt me, mold me, fill me, use me. Spirit of the living God, fall fresh on me. Spirit of the living God, fall fresh on me. Spirit of the living God, fall fresh on me. Melt me, mold me, fill me, use me. Spirit of the living God, fall fresh on me. Spirit of the living God, fall fresh on me. Spirit of the living God, fall fresh on me. Melt me, mold me, fill me, use me. Spirit of the living God, fall fresh on me. Awesome. Let's see if it happens. All right, let's continue on. Go ahead and bring up my teaching stuff. Chris, Just a couple words before we get kicking on this teaching and this series. First of all, big thank you to folks who showed up for the PFLAG event this past Tuesday night. If you see some people wearing a thing like this, it says Celebrate Diversity, that's what that's about. I invited you to come, and there were maybe a dozen crosswalkers and a whole bunch of folks from PFLAG itself, and it was a very powerful event. Let's just put it that way. So important for a faith community like Crosswalk to open its doors to an event. The gay community, the LGBTQI community, they are often very unwelcome in places of faith. And that was the topic of the night, was what do we do with our faith? How do we develop this faith when the faith tradition itself has essentially said, you're not welcome here? And sometimes they say that with overtones. Sometimes they say that with a cold shoulder or a rebuff. And sometimes they just flat out say it. And we heard stories of that Tuesday night, of people who in no uncertain terms were told, even though these kids may have been born and raised in this particular church, that these families, these parents of these kids have known people for decades. They've been told, you're really not welcome here. And until you get your act together, we really don't want to see you back. That is the reality for most gay people. And that is not Jesus. And so I was very happy that we could be a space to welcome them in and say to them, you are welcome here. Crosswalk is a place that will welcome you. We welcome everybody. And you're allowed to be who you are and grow and who God has created you to be. And for me personally, it was a very humbling night because so many of my colleagues have, with the ideal and the goal of being faithful and righteous, have done the opposite and have caused untold harm on entire people groups and made that okay for their places of faith. And I'm ashamed of it and embarrassed by it, horrified by it. So anyway, thank you to those of you who were able to be here. It was it was just incredibly powerful and important, and so proud of Crosswalk that we're that kind of place. So anyway, well done to you as a whole, and well done to you who could make it that night. I know more wanted to make it and weren't able to. This really is right in line with this meditation and prayer verse that I stuck in your guide today, which comes from 1 John 4:7 and 8. It says, my beloved friends, there's even a camp song that goes with this, but I'm not going to torture you with that. It says, my beloved friends, let us continue to love each other, since love comes from God. Everyone who loves is born of God and experiences a relationship with God. What a profound thing for a person to say in the first century. That everyone who loves is born of God and experiences a relationship with God. Even if their mouth is saying, if they're these lovely people loving other people, if their mouth is saying, I don't believe in God, I don't believe in God, and yet they're experiencing love in so many different ways, guess what? These people who are saying with their mouths, I don't believe in God, they are on some very fundamental level in relationship with God. That is such a profoundly different way to think. And yet there it is. However, there seems to be a choice in this. The person who refuses to love doesn't know the first thing about God, because God is love. So you can't know him if you don't love. In other words, there's this intentional act we can engage of refusing to love, which distances us from the God who is as close as our next breath. And in those moments of refusal to love, we make a conscious decision to know God a little less in our life, which is why I wanted it for this series, for today, and in light of PFLAG from Tuesday night. Just so critical. When we love, we understand the depths of God. And Jesus was all about this, by the way. He broke barriers left and right and took a hit every time he did. But he's Jesus, and he's the one we claim to follow. Today we're talking about weaponizing fear. I didn't spell it right on this thing, but it's not weaponing fear. I don't know if that's a word. but I know weaponizing is. What we're really talking about is terrorism, and Hamilton does a great job in his book. So let's go to the next slide, and this is where we're going today. So just want to put before your attention this acronym for fear, which I learned many years ago. False expectations appearing real, that sometimes we believe so much, and that's the way it's going to be, but what if we're wrong from the get-go about what we're even thinking or seeing, and that's leading us to all kinds of behavior that if we knew the facts, we would look at things differently. In fact, in the bottom area there in that panel, this is the process that Hamilton recommends throughout his book, which I think is really good. That instead of false expectations appearing real, we face our fears with faith. More on that in a second. We examine our assumptions in light of the facts. So what do the facts actually say? We're going to look at some facts today. And then attack your anxieties with actions. What practices can we put into motion that will keep us focused on reality rather than the falsehood, which is causing anxiety and fear in us? And then finally, release your cares to God. So I want to talk about the first and last thing on that. What does facing fear with faith look like? Well, facing fear with your faith is not this blanket, saccharine, oh, God's working it all out, it's just going to be okay. And that's not really the picture, as if God's in control and is going to, like pawns on a chessboard, has got it all worked out, so oh, never mind about the Holocaust, never mind about racism or oppression of various forms, because God's got that all worked out, and somehow that's all part of God's plan, and just rest in that. That's not what I'm saying, because I don't think God was behind the Holocaust, didn't want the Holocaust, didn't want American slavery, doesn't want oppression, so that can't be part of God's will. God can massage and work with all that. That's a very different thing than saying that God is orchestrating it. But what we can say, this is what Hamilton says and why I like his stuff so much, because it resonates with me a lot, is that if we look at the created order itself, Richard Rohr hits on this too, by the way, and we believe that God is fundamentally good, then as we see in the very creation story, every step of the way, every movement of creation, even though it's a poem, it's the way the Jewish people wanted to express a different way of how creation came to be, every step of the way it was good, 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 reflecting a very good God, culminating in humanity, which is very good, made in the image of God. It's all good. There's all this goodness abounding, this life thing, this creation thing. It's good. And so what facing fears with faith means is that we do have this abiding undercurrent in us, a foundation that believes that the very created order reflects the Creator, which is essentially and fundamentally good. It doesn't mean that we turn a blind eye to death and suffering. We understand death is a part of reality. In fact, there's a perennial tradition that understands that there is life, there is death, but then there's renewal. That's part of the created order. We know we experience this throughout our lives, that we go through life, we hit things that feel and smell a lot like death. We think it's going to be the end of us, but then for some strange reason, we come out of it, we emerge new and different. In fact, you may not know this, but you have done this already countless times throughout your life, and you didn't even know it was happening. Because every month or so, on a cellular level, you become a new person. You really are not who you were last month. I've been wanting to talk to you about that. No, seriously, that's how your body works. It is always taking place. It's always swapping out. That is the way it works. People are fundamentally very good. And that is sort of the overriding belief in things. And that gives us a different orientation towards everything. There are anomalies. It doesn't mean we discount mental illness. It doesn't mean we discount people who get so into one particular train of thought that they go off the rails and do horrific things. Yes, that happens. But overwhelmingly, humanity is good. They're good-natured. And that's a beautiful thing. We see it every time there's a natural disaster right before our eyes. Am I right? Earthquake happens. 9/11 happens. The fires happen. The community comes together. They no longer see all the distinctives that have kept them separate. They love each other. Humanity is fundamentally very, very good. That's what it means. So let's just jump into some facts on this. And by the way, the release your cares to God, I said I was going to do that. there are some things that we can do, examining our assumptions in light of the facts. So we get the facts. There are things that we can employ to help keep those things in front of us so that we don't go off the rails ourselves. But then after we've done all we can do, there's only one thing left to do. Release our cares to God. And that's all you can do. Because if you just stew on these things, they'll kill you. You know, yesterday we celebrated the life of Debbie Fothery, who was an amazing woman. And this place was packed. And story after story recounted her faith, her love, her joy, and the fact that she gave her life away in so many countless ways, sowing into the lives of others. The many times that we talked over the last 15 months, that stayed true. She had moments of fear and anxiety, of course, but you know, it did not eat her alive because she continually faced her fears with God and released her cares to God. And it gave her tremendous peace, and gave Peyton, her husband, tremendous peace. That, you know, he's a living example of Paul's words saying there is a peace that passes understanding. Peyton is living that right now, and he has been for some time. It's because he's employed this stuff. So let's get some facts in our head, because I know you already know what 94 and 10, 49 and 1, 9,600, 120, 2,000, 7,000 mean. So 94 and 10, since 2001, since 9/11 happened, there have been 10 terrorist attacks on American soil. 10 terrorist attacks on American soil, resulting in 94 deaths. 49 of those deaths happened in one event in Orlando, Florida, at a nightclub that was oriented toward the LGBTQ community. So that means that you had, do my math here, 45, I think my math is right, and the remaining 9. Interestingly, in that same time period, 9,600 people in the United States died by lightning strike. Lightning strike. When I read that, I was like, I need to be really worried about lightning strike. I'm not sure I'm ever going to go to the mountains again, or Kansas for that matter. So anyway, that's kind of a sobering thing, which means that you are 120 times more likely to die by lightning strike than terrorism in the United States on American soil. Put that into perspective. We joke around about lightning strikes. Some of it's real stat-based stuff, like, oh, well, you're more likely to get struck by lightning than win the lottery, right? And we kind of say that and say, this is so remote, it is never going to happen. Yes, that's right. You are 120 times more likely to never have it happen than you are that other thing that is never going to happen. So does that make total sense to you? Of course it does. You are 2,000 times more likely to die in the United States by an American-born murderer than you are terrorism from an outside source, which we looked at a few weeks ago. You don't have much to worry about there either. That statistically speaking, it is so unlikely to happen that you can sleep well at night. You are 7,000 times more likely to die in a car wreck than you are by terrorism. So that is sort of the facts of the matter. Now, we get all worked up because we hear about a bombing, you know, one more bombing and so many people killed. But in my blog that releases at 12 today, I give you a hyperlink to a story map that shows you statistically, and you can play around with not the numbers, but you can play around a little bit with the dates, like the years, to see where terrorism has happened globally with a click of a button. It's really interesting. So at the writing of this book, which was 2017, you could scroll down and see where terrorism happened all over the world. Not one episode happened in the United States in all of 2017. And so far in 2018, there has not been an episode in the United States. So looking at that is sobering. And you can also identify very quickly where it's happening a lot. And it's not a surprise. It's happening a lot in the Middle East. It's happening a lot where there is Islamic terrorism and extremism happening. So in parts of Africa, you see it bubble up. We know that because we're tied to Kenya here, and that does happen in northern Kenya and on the coast on occasion, and sometimes even in Nairobi. So those things do happen. But one that we don't talk about a lot is in Colombia. There's a lot of terrorism going on in Colombia. because that country's a mess. And all kinds of things are happening there, but that one doesn't make the news so much. So there is a lot of terrorism happening over there. Interesting also is how few people of European or American descent died in those foreign attacks. I think it amounts to 1.7% of all the people killed in all of 2017 by Islamic terrorists were of European or United States descent. The remainder, by the way, were Muslims. So this is a Muslim terrorist group that is killing predominantly other Muslims. And that leads us to this question: is ISIS Islam? When we hear ISIS, do we naturally need to think that that is the poster child for what Islam is? And by extension then, are all or most Muslims terrorists, even though they may not be carrying a saber or packing a vest or something? So first, I'll give you my methodology for trying to unpack this. I did a whole teaching on Islam. You're welcome to go back into the archives and find it. Kind of gives you the overview, but also kind of a wide-eyed view about, well, how do we think about terrorism and all that. I also want to tell you that there are plenty of sources other than Pete Shaw that you can find on the internet. And if you Google search ISIS or do a YouTube search, I am absolutely certain you are going to find other people who sound very convinced that what I'm telling you is not true. And they are going to tell you, absolutely, ISIS is the real face of Islam. You should be very afraid, and you should be afraid of all Muslims, because in their heart of hearts, they're ISIS too. There are those out there. There are even people with letters after their names who are saying that. And so the question is, how do we come to a conclusion on this thing? This is how I came to my conclusion on this thing. First, not long after 9/11 happened, I read the entire Quran, which sounds really impressive. It's not a big book. It's not hard to read. And a lot of it's very repetitive. So I read it just because I thought, boy, there's a lot of talk about the Quran. I wonder what it says. I could probably get a copy. You can too. And in fact, they're free. So go ahead and get one. Download it on your device and read it. It's not going to take you that long. And what you're going to discover is that the original text does say some things that call for violence, and they say a lot of things that talk about the grace of God and the need to extend hospitality to strangers and even your enemies at times, which we know stories from our own military have actually happened. So if we take the same approach as we do to our Bible, of knowing that every verse we read has to be taken in context, has to be taken in its original setting and for its original audience, and understood very clearly within that cultural reality, then what we get to is, well, this. If you think that the Quran is filled with violence and calling people to violence, then the Bible is only 10 times more so. And if you wanted to go radical with the Bible, you could, because there are plenty of verses in there that call for clear, decisive violence to people, including women and children, and even animals. It's in there. This is one of the reasons why people, sometimes walk away from the faith. Now, is it wise to then say, well, then why aren't we killing more people? Let's kill more people because it's in the Bible. No, because we understand with context that we're looking at an ancient text written for an ancient time for ancient people, and that's not the right thing to pull out. So, taken in context, you understand the Quran much differently. Then the thing I would look at, as I did with Christianity in our own scriptures, is I want to know what the scholars are saying about the core issues of the faith. Not cherry-picked scholars, that may just be in one particular camp to affirm my belief, and they've got lots of letters under my name, so I'm going to put all my eggs in that basket. But what is the collection, the collective of scholars in the Muslim world, from their seminaries, their theological institutions? What are they saying about their own faith? Because they're the actual experts. And without question, the overwhelming majority of scholars from the Muslim world are in one accord. They denounce ISIS as a strange collection of people that are bent on violence for other reasons, and that they are not reflective of Islam. That's what the body of scholars are saying, which kind of lines up with the fact that ISIS, the primary target for whatever reason, is wiping out more Muslims, not less. And then the final thing is to simply look at data and find out how many people are dying at the hands of ISIS and Muslims in general. And if we decide to take that tack of just looking at the sheer numbers of how many people have been killed in the name of which religion, and therefore which religion should we be most suspect of, friends, we are the winners. Because Christianity has been co-opted in so many ways throughout history that we absolutely, without question, we win by a landslide as Christian people. If there's any faith to fear, it's Christianity, if we take that metric. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist or a mathematician to crunch those numbers. Just think about Whoppers. How about them crusades? Untold thousands killed under threat of death if they didn't confess Christ. So they confessed Christ, and then they were killed so that they would not have the opportunity to recount. Let's go on up to the rifts between Catholicism and Protestantism. Our own heritage, our own Baptists in our background, killed in our own waters that we just got baptized in because we went against the Mother Church. Let's talk about American slavery, how we took that to a whole new level using the Bible as our foundation to give us the right to dehumanize an entire skin tone of people and variance therein, and continued oppression ever since. There was a new landmark that just opened up. I can't remember if it's Alabama or Mississippi. Is it Mississippi that recognizes the lynchings that happened in the United States, using Scripture as a basis to give them the right to do that. And there were thousands. I had no idea there were thousands and thousands of Christian people doing this to other people. And then, of course, let's not leave Hitler out of it. A good German comes from similar places I do, at least in his gene pool, who used, again, a weird interpretation of Scripture to give them the right to kill millions of Jewish people. Christians win. In fact, as Hamilton was trying to navigate his way around this over time, he had heard this crazy idea on American soil that some people overseas, in the Middle East especially, actually think that the United States created ISIS to cause disruption within the Muslim world. Isn't that crazy? And he's like, oh, come on, you gotta be kidding me. So he was in Egypt doing something, and he's talking to a group of Muslim people. And he said, hey, I heard this funny thing. I know that there's this idea that the United States created ISIS to disrupt the Muslim world. And I said, yeah, we totally buy that. I have a hunch that if I went into certain parts of the world, especially as clergy, and I went into parts of the Middle East and announced to them that I am Christian, that they would immediately look at me with suspect because of how they have understood who we are and what we have represented. And of course, we're fuzzy in America about, well, are we a Christian nation or we're not? But we kind of think we are because it's sort of our rootedness, kind of, sort of, but not really. And so we think we're a Christian nation, which means that the cross and the flag are draped and go together wherever our military goes. So, is ISIS Islam? No, it's not. Are most Muslims terrorists? No. If they are, they're really bad ones because they're getting wiped out by the hundreds of thousands. So we got to think about that. So why is it then that we look at Muslims in particular, especially the ones from the Middle East, even though that's not where most Muslims live? Most Muslims, by the way, live in Indonesia. They don't even look like Middle Easterners because they're not from the Middle East. So the majority of Muslims live in Indonesia, so let that sink in for a little bit. So why is it that we have such an easy time being so suspicious of people that look like they're from the Middle East? And actually, a story from World War II prisoner treatment came to mind for me this week. So in the United States, during World War II, we had several prison camps on our American soil. And there were two different prisoners, primarily, that we held. We had German prisoners of war, that were caught in battle overseas and brought back and put into POW camps. And then there were Japanese citizens who were ripped away from the businesses that they started, the families that they were trying to raise, many who right here from the Bay Area and certainly the West Coast, and put in internment camps, which is a nice way of saying another prisoner of war camp. And they were put in there because they were suspect. We weren't sure if we could trust them, even though they had pledged to the American flag and taken the vow. So I wonder, who got the better treatment? The Germans, who with their lives and with their military were killing America's sons and daughters, who pledged to wipe us out if given the opportunity, or the Japanese Americans who pledged allegiance to the flag. Which one got better treatment? The Germans, by far. One podcast I was listening to talked about how this one kind of, I think it was in Utah or Wyoming or somewhere up in that neck of the woods, that they got funding to bring in musical instruments so that they could put together an orchestra and they would put on shows for the nearby town and have a language academy inside and have higher education available for everybody. And that was happening and funded by the United States government all the while. In other parts of the country, maybe all parts of the country, they were released from the camps to go in and work in the fields and with industry and all that, to rub shoulders with good American citizens, and then at night they'd go right back. That's reality. That's our American history. Meanwhile, our actual citizens who didn't look like us had to live in squalor, not funded by our U.S. government. Why the discrepancy? Well, it's pretty obvious. One of those groups of people looks like us, and the other does not. We can trust who looks like us, but those who don't look like us, as I taught you last week, we have implicit bias against. And borne out all the way leads to radical difference in treatment. And that's what we got to manage all the time. There's a great musical called South Pacific. I was in South Pacific here in Napa forever ago, and it's a great show. I loved the show. It's got great music in it. It's got great storylines, funny storylines. There's a romance in there. But you know what I think makes this particularly enduring as a musical is because of the point that it makes. This musical packs a punch, and it hits us now as much as it ever did. And think about when this show came out. I think in the late 50s is when this show came out, when a lot of American soldiers had come back from the war, and there was a lot of unease about relationships between American soldiers and particularly the women that they found themselves in the company with over in the Pacific Theater. And how do we understand how all that works together now that the war is over? And so there's a particular song I immediately thought of when I was looking at this week. And it's grainy. There are multiple songs I could have picked with much better clarity, but I wanted you to hear this because I think the guy that sings this was probably the original guy on Broadway with this show. And the people that are setting it up are Rodgers and Hammerstein, the guys who wrote it. The guy playing the piano is the guy who wrote the music, and the guy you're going to hear talk and set it up is the guy who wrote the lyrics. So I know it's grainy. It's also written. You may pick this up from the early parts of it. This was broadcast for some kind of interfaith dialogue peacekeeping thing in the United States, sometime I'm guessing in the 1950s, to promote peace. So let's check it out on the next screen and see what you think. Yeah, you'll need to crank it up, Jason.
The National Conference of Christians and Jews have the help of Richard Rodgers at the piano and Oscar Hammerstein in setting the mood of Brotherhood Week with one of their famous tunes.
In the second act of South Pacific, a young American Navy nurse explaining her race prejudice says, "I can't help this. This is emotion. It's born in me. And the second character, the man who is losing her because of this prejudice, shouts his protest. I do not believe this. I do not believe these things are born in you. And the third character, a young Marine lieutenant, played by my friend here, Bill Tabbert, says,
it's not born in you. It happens after you're born. You've got to be taught to hate and fear. You've got to be taught from year to year. It's got to be drummed in your dear little ear. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught to be afraid of people whose eyes are oddly made, and people whose skin is a different shade. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught before it's too late, before you are 6 or 7 or 8, to hate all the people your relatives hate. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be carefully taught.
So true. Still today, so true. We are not born with racist tendencies. The younger the kids get, before they're 3-4 years old, they have no problem playing with anybody. Doesn't matter what they look like. But something happens. They get taught. They pick it up through innuendo. They pick it up through language. They pick it up through body language and fear and everything else. And they begin to own it and think that's normal, natural, and good. You've got to be carefully taught. This was an issue for the early church, by the way. There's a story we're going to look at about Philip and the Ethiopian. This is after Pentecost happened, the church is being persecuted, and they're trying to go into new regions just to stay alive, and they're communicating the good news they found in Jesus. Philip, at this point in the story, is in Samaria, which is its own amazing thing, because Jewish people as a whole couldn't stand Samaritan people as a whole, just to the north, and talk terribly about them, and yet here the early church is trying to build something there, and something amazing. And then there's this message that Philip gets. So let's just take a look at the text and see where it takes us. On the next slide, perhaps. There it is. So later, God's angel spoke to Philip. At noon today, I want you to walk over to that desolate road that goes from Jerusalem down to Gaza. And Philip, he got up and went. He met an Ethiopian eunuch coming down the road. Now, it's a real bummer for this Ethiopian that he's always known from this point forward as the Ethiopian Eunuch. Thanks, writer of Acts. I mean, that's awful. But they actually give it to us for a reason, because it was not uncommon in antiquity. This is one way that many scholars believe is why it's there, that boys at a young age would literally be castrated, making them a eunuch, to make them more fit for government service, so that primarily they could be more trusted with the women folk around the court. And so it wasn't that uncommon, and that's what most of them think it means. There's some other thoughts on it, but that one makes the most sense. Which also means that in an interesting way, that word eunuch is curious in antiquity also, because it carries with it some overtones that would relate to our LGBTQ realities, which just creates more reason why Philip, a good Jewish guy, would not want to come alongside this guy. He's from a different nation, very powerful nation, almost as powerful as Rome. They controlled most of northern Africa, very wealthy, and as we see some about this guy, he's a big deal. So the eunuch had been on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem and was returning to Ethiopia, where he was minister in charge of all the finances of Candace, queen of the Ethiopians. So this guy holds the pen to the checkbook. He was riding in a chariot and reading the prophet Isaiah, which he probably bought at a gift shop outside the temple. The Spirit told Philip, climb into the chariot. Running up alongside, Philip heard the eunuch reading Isaiah and asked, do you understand what you're reading? And he answered, how can I without some help? And then invited Philip into the chariot with him. The passage he was reading was this. I think it's Isaiah 58, somewhere in there. As a sheep led to slaughter, and quiet as a lamb being sheared, he was silent, saying nothing. He was mocked and put down, never got a fair trial. But who now can count his kin, since he's been taken from the earth? The eunuch said, tell me, who is the prophet talking about? Himself or some other? And Philip grabbed his chance. Using this passage as his text, he preached Jesus to him. Now, you need to know that this text, in its original context, was actually talking about the people of Israel, the people of God. It was used in a similar fashion by Philip to say, well, you know, like Israel was the suffering servant, Jesus has become the suffering servant in a similar kind of a way. And yet God was with him. And so then that gave him the license to talk about Jesus, which that's cool. And as they continued down the road, they came to a stream of water. And the eunuch said, here's water. Why can't I be baptized? And he ordered the chariot to stop. They both went down to the water, and Philip baptized him on the spot. When they came up out of the water, the Spirit of God suddenly took Philip off, and that was the last the eunuch saw of him. But he didn't mind. He had what he'd come for and went on down the road as happy as he could be. Philip showed up in Azotus and continued north, preaching the message in all the villages along that route until he arrived at Caesarea. This is looked at as the first international mission outside of Palestine in the early church. And you need to see and just appreciate all the stuff that Philip had to get over to do this. First, his normal, natural Jewish way of thinking of Palestine is our home. That's our borders. That's the promised land, so we're going to stay here. And now he's here. Nope, it's not just there. This is going global. So I want you to go global with this thing. And that means you're going to have to mix it up with people who don't look like you. The darkest skin we can find. Let's find a guy from Ethiopia. He's on the road now, so just get on down there and see what happens. And he actually does it. He takes significant risk. Who knows what could happen? This could be terrible. But he trusts that God is calling him to do this thing so that the good news about God through Jesus would be understood. The important thing you need to hear on this is that it's not enough for us to just have high intellectual thoughts about, oh, equality is a great idea. We should really believe in that. We do from the comfort of our own home. No, what we are called to do is actually do something about it. First and foremost, with understanding and managing our own bias, our own language, the ways that we have been carefully taught, intentionally or unintentionally, to affirm a racial implicit bias that we may not even know is there. So we're called to do that. That's part of our becoming whole and healed and well, to have God-fashioned eyes that truly sees everybody as made in the image of God and good and worth grace and dignity. So we need to do that. But then it goes way beyond that. To when we recognize people groups that are being oppressed, it is incumbent on the Jesus people who dare to say things like, go be Jesus, to actually show up and go be Jesus. So it means that even if you as a woman have never experienced, or have maybe you've never realized that you've experienced some kind of discrimination simply based on your gender, so you're like, well, why do I need to join a women's march? Or if you're a guy, why do I need to join a women's march? If they got an issue, let them march. No, you're Jesus people. We need to be alongside people who are in this struggle. We need to be the ones who are saying, on behalf of the kingdom of God, you matter. And equality is a good thing. So just translate that into every other category of oppressed people you can think of. The church should always be at the front of the line, saying, we're going to treat everybody with dignity, respect, and equality. In reality, the church has almost always lagged behind. There may have been a few voices within the church that are calling for action, but the church as a whole has always been slow, painfully slow. And so was the early church. This happened. There's another story that comes later where Peter's mixing it up with a guy named Cornelius, who's a military commander with Rome. He's Gentile. His whole household's Gentile. Yet Peter receives this word, go there and do this thing. Go talk to them. He doesn't want to do it. He shows up. The first words out of his mouth is, I don't really want to be here. I think you people are terrible. I shouldn't be speaking to you at all. And yet I'm here, and I'm going to because God told me to, even though I don't want to. And he proceeds to start into this sermon. And halfway through it, the Spirit of God dumps on all these Gentile people. And they start speaking in tongues and stuff, which lets Peter know in no uncertain terms, oh, I guess God is with these people. I guess God loves these people. He's treating them just like he's treated the Jewish people. So I guess we could go baptize them since God's already welcomed them. So he does it. And you know what happened next? Peter got his butt kicked. He goes back to Jerusalem to tell them the good news about what happened on that seaside visit. And he got his butt kicked by the other Christians and leadership saying, what are you thinking? That's all just to say that this is a normal human process and that the church has always been slow. There's always been a few at the front who get it, who lead the charge, and eventually it's like the whole church just slowly catches up. Crosswalk is one of those earlier ones. We're not the earliest, but we're one of the earlier ones. And we need to treat that with great seriousness and own it and celebrate it and see it as a privilege. So to help us get toward this thing, go ahead and go to the next slide, Chris. There's one last thing on my list, and it has to do with Ann Wagner. So please welcome Ann Wagner to the stage. So, if you don't know Ann Wagner, she is an extraordinarily amazing person. Just ask her husband. He will tell you all about her. Thank you, Gordon, for agreeing with me on that. I'm sharing the stage with a person with great aptitude and background. She had the opportunity to go to one of two colleges, both amazing. One you may have heard of called Stanford University, and the other one called William and Mary, and she chose William and Mary. I don't know why, but anyway, she went there for that. Ended up getting your master's at Wheaton, I think. Is that right? Yeah. And then around age 27, you did what crazy thing?
I moved to Vietnam.
And why did you do that?
I wanted to live overseas and live out a Christian life somewhere where people didn't often get to see Christians. Some people call it being a missionary. I'm very uncomfortable with that word because it comes with a lot of baggage and because it's illegal to be a missionary in a communist country. So I was a teacher. But that's what I did.
All right. And I mean, going at 27 years old, you look pretty white to me. I'm wondering, what kind of fears did you have going into a country where you were going to be very isolated?
Yeah. It's interesting. I didn't have, looking back, I think I was a little naive in my fears. I was afraid of being homesick. I was afraid of not meeting people, but I wasn't afraid of being treated differently, and I ended up being treated pretty differently. I was afraid of culture shock. But more than anything, my parents and friends of their generation were really nervous about me going to Vietnam. My dad had fought in Vietnam, and it was hard. It was hard for them to wrap their brain around that. And I remember one time when my parents realized they had been stationed in Germany in the 70s, and their parents had had a really, really hard time with that. And there was a moment where both of my parents realized that 30 years after World War II, they had been called to Germany. And now about 30 years after the Vietnam War, I was going to Vietnam. And it was this moment where they realized countries that are our enemy at one point don't have to stay our enemies, which was really a valuable lesson for me as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And did you get any people saying things that may have actually caused your anxiety to increase as you were thinking about going over?
Yeah, definitely. I had funny pieces of advice. I went right after the tsunami in Thailand, and one woman was like, if you see animals running, run in the same direction. And I was like, oh Lord, what am I doing? But I was pretty far from a beach, so it was okay. but there are just those things where you just don't know what awaits you in a place where you've never been before. And I also had a really dear friend who is African American who said, she said, I think it's really brave that you're choosing to go somewhere where you will be a minority. And it hadn't really dawned on me before she said that to me. I was like, oh, I'm going to be a minority. I wonder what that will be like. And it was, you know, even though as a white person, I had the benefit of being a desirable minority. In Vietnam, a lot of my Vietnamese friends, women will use like skin lightening cream. People want to be lighter. People want hair that's a little fuller. So even though I was kind of a desirable look, I was so different that people didn't know what to do with me. So I would go to the market, I would get groped by strangers, I would have people just shouting at me. Occasionally I got hit by people, sometimes people threw rocks at me because I was one of 4 white people living in a city of millions. So it was just a novelty. I called it tapping on the glass. Like I was an animal in a zoo and people are like, hey, who's that? But so that got tiring for sure. But I think actually my biggest fear actually happened, I realized it when I was about 2 weeks in to living there. And I had this total breakdown moment where I thought, I'm never gonna make a friend here. Never. This place is too different. Everyone is too different. I get emotional even thinking about it now because it was such a strong fear, such a strong feeling that I was just gonna wither and that I would never make a friend. And I realized that it was later that I went to a friend's house after a really kind of a rough day at school, and I went to a friend's house and I was crying to her, and she, you know, started making jokes and making me laugh. We rode her bicycle to the market to get some tutua, which is one of those things that doesn't have a great translation. It means sour milk, because who wouldn't want to eat sour milk when you're not feeling great? But it's like kind of like frozen yogurt. It's delicious. But I remember that moment of, and this was like a year and a half into my time there, and I was like, oh, this is what's happening. I was afraid this would never happen. This is what I was afraid would never happen. And now I have a wealth of friends that I can go to and who will be my first reaction if I'm having a bad day. I have people to choose from, people who will support me. And I hadn't realized that I wouldn't be alone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. So as we are living in the tension of still struggling as an American people and as people with this fear of the other, what kind of advice would you give us moving forward?
It's a good question. I think one of the big things I learned from my time overseas was, I didn't expect to go to Asia. It wasn't where people are often like, oh, you must have had a special heart for Vietnam. And I'm like, no, I didn't. It was not like, nothing about it was a natural progression. It fell in my lap. And I remember even when I first got the opportunity being like, I don't want to do that. And I said it out loud because I knew that I was going to do that. And I was like, oh, I know. And then, but it just makes me think about how often Jesus in his ministry and in his time here was uncomfortable. And he put himself into places where he was uncomfortable. And I think in that discomfort, there's a lot to be learned and a lot to be gained. And I went to a place where I was immensely uncomfortable at times. And I'm really glad I did. I came back to America, and then I was immensely uncomfortable with America. So it changed me. But it was one of those things that I look at the person we're following, and he made choices to reach out to people who were really unlike him. And he didn't hesitate when he heard, when someone kind of came to him and said, I need you. And I think that there's something really valuable there.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much, Ann, for sharing your story, everybody. She's also our chair of our stewards as well, so thank you for all you bring to the table. Very good. So to finish out this teaching, one of the things I wanted to share with you is that this is not just a Jesus thing, it's a Jewish thing. Jesus was Jewish. And you find this command, it's a command, all throughout the Old Testament, different kind of wording and different kind of context. But this one from Jeremiah, which is late in their history and things have not gone well for Israel, they feel threatened by surrounding enemies and stuff. And this is what the word of the Lord was coming through Jeremiah to the people. Be fair-minded and just. Do what is right. Help those who have been robbed. Rescue them from their oppressors. Quit your evil deeds. Do not mistreat foreigners, orphans, and widows. Stop murdering the innocent. The interesting thing about this passage is that we're still struggling with the same kind of people groups and whether or not to do something about it. And there's no question about it. The heart of God says, go do something about it. Go help. Go be helpful. This is who you are, and the reason I'm telling you this is because this is how I've treated you. You love because I loved you. This is a part of what it means to be human. This is a part of what it means to walk with God, is to give it away, to be supportive of those who need your help. And, you know, we're going to talk about politics next week, so that'll be a lot of fun. But lots of talk about issues around immigration and fear, and lots of speaking that put us in a binary thinking, like it has to be this way or that way. There's no in between. And when we talk about very complex issues like immigration, like so many other things, racial inequality, etc., we have to remember in the back of our mind, no, we are not given the luxury of opting out here as Jesus people. When we say go be Jesus, it means, well, how are we going to do this? Because it's an amazing invitation. Don't hear it as, you better do this, but hear it as, hey man, you get to change the world. You get to be a part of the biggest thing ever. You want to be a part of the biggest thing ever? If you just want to waste your life on your own little kingdom, blah, 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 that's boring. Boring and small, and all your castles are going to turn to dust eventually. But if you want to be a part of something that's way bigger than yourself, that makes a difference in history, then come on, let's do this thing together. And it's exciting, thrilling, high risk, very uncomfortable at times, but it just might change history, and we need it to change. So Jesus people, that's what you got. Let's pray together. So God, as we leave this space and head out the door, we are confessing to you that we're still learning to fly here. We're not quite sure how to do this thing, and we need your help. We need your help first and foremost to see the eyes with which we see, so that we can begin to be honest about how our vision has been formed, about how we see the whole world and its people. Because that is something that every one of us needs to manage. So help us, God. Help us just to evaluate our implicit bias. Help us to evaluate our language, our attitudes across the board, and put those against facts and see where we need to grow. And then, God, I pray that you would create in us a heart that longs to see more Jesus in the world, more going where they weren't supposed to go, helping people they weren't supposed to help, because that's exactly what you're about. So help us, if we really want to experience life to the full and more of you in our lives, help us really be open and willing to go be Jesus. And as we see things happen that only you can do, even if it's uncomfortable for us at the time, we'll give you thanks and praise for doing your amazing work all around us, in front of us, and through us. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you, God. Keep us safe, keep us well, keep us strong. Until next week, in Jesus' name, amen. So we have one last song for you. If you've got a clue-in comment or an offering or whatever, please put those in the cans on the table, and we will see you next week. Thanks for coming.
All right, I need you to stand for this one. We're going to wake you up. Sorry, Pete, I meant Hey, just FYI, you know, a lot of these songs I do are not your traditional church songs, but I always attach into a scripture, and this song by Tom Petty, Learning to Fly, is always, from the beginning, reminding me of Isaiah, where it says, "But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." And I love that. And that's what I think of every time I sing this song. Where's our drummer?
You know where if Bruce is out there.
You've heard this song enough. Please sing it with me. Well, I started out down a dirty road. Started out all alone. The sun went down across the hill, and the town lit up. The world got still. I'm learning to fly, but I ain't got wings. Coming down is the hardest thing. Now the good old days may not return. The rocks might melt, the sea may burn. I'm learning to fly, but I ain't got wings. Coming down is the hardest thing. Yes, it is. Good old days may not return. Yeah, to break your heart and steal your crown. So it started out, God knows where, but I guess I know when I get there. I'm learning to fly above the clouds. What goes up must come down. I'm learning to fly, but I ain't got wings. Coming down is the hardest thing. Fly, but I ain't got wings. Coming down is the hardest thing. I'm gonna learn to fly. I'm gonna learn to fly. I'm gonna mount up with wings, just like an eagle. mount up with wings just like eagles. I'm learning to fly, but I ain't got wings. Coming down is the hardest thing. Have a wonderful week.